Thank you very much, Robert. I'll just run through very quickly a lot of the information that has been presented already by a number of people. My father was born in Bratislava. As a young man, he studied both medicine and sculpture in parallel. After graduating in sculpture under Professor Josef Mulner, he gave up medicine and took up sculpture full-time. He focused on a series of public commissions in the social housing projects in Vienna. I seem to run ahead of myself with the slides. That's him with his kiln, probably in Vienna. And those are some pictures that Eva Branscombe presented this morning. Here's another frieze on a red Vienna facade. Okay. In 1937, he travelled to South Africa, where he had successful exhibitions in Pretoria and Johannesburg. Then he continued east and settled in Bali for 2 years. And this shot was taken by my father crossing the Straits of Bali from Java to Bali. When the war spread to the Pacific, he made his way to Australia, where he gained major commissions as described by Jim Berto this morning on the bronze doors of the Mitchell Library, the Wishing Tree Memorial, and the Botanical Gardens, and he helped to establish the Mariola group of artists in Sydney. In 1948, he travelled by ship to Europe with the intention of visiting his family home in Bratislava. But due to the political upheaval, he remained in London, where he met his future wife, Joy, my mother, and he never returned to Bratislava. On the ship, he met Walter Warboys at one of the captain's dinners that are traditionally held on transatlantic voyages. And Walter Warboys was head of the plastics division at this new company called ICI. So there began a formative collaboration in which Fleischmann made perspex his signature material. And this is probably the first perspex carving that my father did. And of course, you'll note that the theme is a Balinese one. So he carved, engraved, assembled, made collages, combined perspex with water and light. When he arrived in London, he met Charles Wheeler, who quickly arranged to sponsor his election as a member of the Royal Society of British Sculptors, and Wheeler became a lifelong champion of Fleischmann's work. At the 1951 Festival of Britain, he was commissioned to create an oval-life-sized bronze fountain piece called Miranda for the Festival Gardens at Battersea. Here's my father with the model. That's the bronze foundry with the various parts of the sculpture being chased. While during the installation, Fleischmann renewed his friendship and rivalry with Siegfried Charroux, who was erecting his work, The Islanders. Charroux, along with Fritz Herkner, had competed with Fleischmann for commissions in the Viennese days before the war. After the festival, Miranda was relocated to the Lockheed headquarters in Leamington Spa. Lockheed were the sponsors of the original sculpture, where the sculpture remained in Leamington Spa as a working fountain until Lockheed sold the site in 2001. On the night, the very night following the sale of the building, the sculpture was stolen from its purpose-built pool. and despite being on the Interpol art theft register, it has never been recovered. Of note is an interview Fleischmann gave to the newspapers during the festival, when the reporter asked him why the mermaid had 2 legs with fins as feet. Fleischmann replied that since he had never seen a mermaid, he was not qualified to comment. Another highlight of Fleischmann's career was the Brussels World Exhibition of 1958. In all, he created 4 large works of art, 2 at the British Pavilion and 2 at the Vatican Pavilion. He spent the best part of a year at work in Brussels. My mother received a special honour called the Benemerente from Pope John XXIII for her unsung and unpaid work assisting my father during that year. I'd like to go off script a bit just now to say that I'd like to emphasise the pivotal role that my mother played in all aspects of my father's career. She was at the same time chauffeur, PA, cook, studio assistant, and masseur. I remember my mother giving my father a massage every morning, well into, until his death at 93. And I reckon that's probably what kept my father going for so long. So the British Pavilion, in addition to the perspex carving depicting Locke's wife, described earlier by Dr. Philip Ward Jackson, my father also created a representation of the royal coat of arms of the United Kingdom, carved with mallet and chisel from a huge block of perspex. I'd like to mention that after the expo, it was displayed in London on Millbank at the offices of the Ministry of Information, I believe. But since that time, probably in the 60s, I have no knowledge of where the sculpture went. So that's a picture of the coat of arms inside the building, with my mother on the left. And that's the exterior of the building. You can see the design of the louvers of the window above. So he also did works at the Vatican Pavilion. They were a triptych of the Holy Rosary depicting the 15 mysteries carved into 3 sheets of polished perspex, like a triptych. Here's a detail of one of the panels. These were all edge-lit with artificial light. The second sculpture he did was an enormous project. It was a large, highly stylized depiction of the resurrection in curved sheets of aluminium, assembled rather like Frank Gehry might do in Bilbao, together with an engraved perspex frieze beneath. The design of the Christ figure was striking in that the arms were held in an upright, upward gesture rather than traditionally outwards. This pose was the result of the necessity of the sculpture to be transported from London to Brussels by train, and the sculpture dimensions were constrained by the width of the carriage. So it had nothing to do with artistic creativity. And here are pictures of the parts of the sculpture being assembled, tested in London before transport to Brussels. So my father often recalled how many of the workmen from the Russian pavilion would spend their lunch breaks attending Mass on the steps of the Vatican Pavilion, which was situated immediately opposite. In 1969, Fleischmann was commissioned by the UK Central Office of Information to create a water sculpture, Harmony and Progress, in perspex for the British Pavilion at Expo 70, Osaka, Japan. Just to go off script again, I remember I was there, I was 9 years old at the time, and of course I travelled with my parents. And on the first day when my father arrived at the building site of the expo, he was greeted by the foreman, who was dressed in full morning coat with a top hat and tails. And he was the foreman on the building site. And such was the formality that they, that was common in Japan at that time. The archive of letters in the Arthur Fleischmann archive bears witness to the awkward and protracted negotiations over remuneration for the commission. Eventually, a very, very difficult agreement was reached, whereby Fleischmann was able to travel to Japan to supervise the installation of the sculpture, but he was able to take along his young family, my mother and myself. It was typical of his life's philosophy that my mother and I always should be involved with all his professional activities. After the expo, the sculpture was transported back to London and eventually sited on the grounds of the World Trade Centre at St Catherine's Dock in London. You can see the Tower of London behind. Many years later, the sculpture fell into disrepair and was finally removed. And this was the source of great disappointment to my father. A disappointment that was compensated for partially when in 1976, he received a commission to create the monument at the docks to celebrate the Queen's Silver Jubilee. At the age of 81, he embraced the challenge and worked on site in a tent over a bitter winter to carve the bas-relief into the largest single piece of acrylic in the world. And I believe it still is the largest piece of acrylic. But that's another story, how that came about. The sculpture is still in St Catherine's Dock today, but has been moved from its original purpose-built site to a less than ideal location. To ensure the long-term future of the piece and to promote its reinstatement to its original site, a listing application was submitted to Historic England. However, on the 3rd of August 2022, we received information that Historic England had declined to take on the application further, since it did not meet their strict criteria, and that the sculpture should be and one of the criteria that they considered was that the sculpture should be under immediate threat. Unfortunately, that was not a fairy tale ending. The information given in this talk was extracted from the archive of approximately 6,500 letters in Fleischmann's archive that have very recently been acquired by Tate in London to be a resource for the nation in perpetuity. And there I'd like to finish. Thank you.